Come almost to the end of the day, but not of the future. We've had a great morning, very visionary, and in continuation of that spirit, it is my pleasure to introduce you to a dear friend and a teacher, Dr. Ashis Nandy. Ashis Nandy can be perhaps best described as an intellectual who combines the grace of a tango dancer in his mind with the lethal abilities of a street fighter when necessary. In a world where intellectual work so often disintegrates into the steady respectability of academies, it's wonderful to have someone whose intellectual work, whose intellectual labor is, I think, an exemplar for all of us who are artists. He's an artist of the mind. Ashis Nandy was born in Bhagalpur in India in 1937. Bhagalpur is a town famous for an incident where people were blinded by the police by having acid poured on them. So it's, I think, quite appropriate that a man of such great vision came to the earth in Bhagalpur to reverse a series of blindings. He's a political psychologist, a social theorist, and a contemporary cultural and political critic. He has worked as a clinical psychologist with an interest in a wide variety of topics, including the legacies of violence in the South Asian subcontinent, the partition of India and Pakistan. He has also thought a lot about public conscience and the dialogue of civilizations. He was senior fellow and director of the Center for the Study of Developing Societies, CSDS, where Jibesh, Monica, and I, along with other colleagues, co-founded an initiative called Sarai in the year 2000. And I think that it was a testament of that ongoing dialogue that another generation at CSDS, we at Sarai at CSDS, in a sense, continue. And it is that dialogue that I'm today bringing to you. Today, he's a senior honorary fellow at the Institute, and apart from being the chairperson of the Committee for Cultural Choices and Global Futures, he continues to be active, vigilant, militant as a public intellectual in India, weighing in with his side jabs to the solar plexus of complacent power. Some of his writing include At the Edge of Psychology, Essays in Politics and Culture, The Intimate Enemy, Loss and Recovery of Self Under Colonialisms, Tradition, Tyranny and Utopias, Essays in the Politics of Awareness, The Savage Freud and Other Essays on Possible and Retrievable Selves, The Illegitimacy of Nationalisms, Rabindranath Tagore and the Politics of Self, and Time Trek's Uncertain Futures of Old and New Despotisms. I believe that he's also published in Mexico, in Spanish, through an imprint of the Colegio de Mexico. Yeah. So he is available here in your libraries and bookshops. Please do take advantage of the fact that he is available both in English and Spanish. Without further ado, I would invite Ashis Nandy to talk to us.
Shuddha has given me 20 minutes, and I have 6 points to make. Roughly 3 minutes each. And I will try to stick to the timetable unless I fall in love with my own voice. No. But first of all, let me thank him for this very kind words of introduction. And I want to thank you and SITAC for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts with you. I've been listening carefully for the last 2 days. I've learned a lot about that. And I thought I chose these 6 issues because in some way, some of these issues run through some of the presentations. I want to sharpen them, hone them, and put it blandly and sharply for you. You don't have to accept them, but I will like a dialogue, even if it is the critical response you have. First, this is primarily a group of artists. So I want to give you some confidence. when the Paris exhibition was held in the year 1900, they decided to talk to the world's best-known scientists to find out what will be the nature of science and how far it will change the world and what form our lives will take in response to new scientific discoveries. Some of the world's, not some, almost all, the best-known names of science were interviewed. And it's a remarkable record of the scope and limits of modern science. For instance, in response to the question, what will be the maximum speed human beings and contraptions built by humans will maximally attain during the next century till the year 2000. No, not 2000, it's 2000. The highest the scientists went was 250 miles an hour. In response to questions on whether something like television could be discovered, most scientists, the most famous ones, said that that would be something for which we have to wait till the 21st century. Even scientists often underestimated their own discoveries. Radio had already been thought of, but even those who were involved in its discovery thought that it will never become a household device. Even Edison didn't believe the electric bulbs will be popular beyond a certain sector of the population. If you compare their predictions with that of any science fiction writer, and Jules Verne was a contemporary of theirs, his predictions, his ideas were much closer to the reality. Indeed, virtually all the things they said would not come till the 21st century arrived on the scene by the 1940s. So sometimes writers, artists, and thinkers, visionaries, can go much farther than scientists, even in the matter of science. Even in the matter of science. Jules Verne had something with the scientists you often didn't have, vision. The future cannot be thought of without visions, because between the present and the future, there is a disjunction. I shall come back to this point. And we can take confidence from this to say that we have a right to envision the future. The future might be closer to the way you envision it. Future cannot come from linear programming of economists. It cannot come from path analysis of social scientists. It cannot be projected from the present because there are disjunctions in human creativity and human initiatives. That's the first point. Everybody doesn't think of it things like that. There is also a fear of the future. W.G. Fields, the famous American wit, was once asked, "What do you think of the future?" He said, "Why should I think of the future? What has the future done for me?" We can take that position too. But others have been at least more open to the idea of the future. Point 2. The future is a negation of the present. Can be a negation of the present. And this is something in human nature, that you think the future will remedy our problems. Future will give you solutions to the problems that haunt us. So you can think of a future which is a negation. To that extent, future is a criticism of the present. This is important because animals have no past and no future. Human beings are the only species that talks of the past and the future. Animals have experience and they have reflexes. The experience sharpens some reflexes, blunts them to others. That's the situation. Human beings can attribute pastness and futureness to things. They can talk of the past and future as if these are realities. It is our construction. And to that extent, to the extent that human beings also are a very diverse lot, let us be prepared for more plural futures, and I would necessarily add more plural pasts. Because once you get out of chronological time, about which Professor Moxie talked yesterday or day before, there is no difference between the past and the future which is unbridgeable. Because the function of the past also can be a criticism of the present. And past also can be construed, it can be constructed in myriad ways. It is possible to have a more open past, but the idea of history, particularly post-Enlightenment history in the West, which is the dominant form of consciousness promoted by states and the powerful and the rich, past cannot be kept that open. The idea of history, this might seem very strange to you, idea of history closes some options in the past. It tries to freeze past. It tries to reduce past through empirical concerns. That's not the way past is looked upon in many civilizations. In many civilizations, the past also is open, because the past can be constructed in various ways, not only through contemporary history. Past also can be constructed in various ways. Myths, legends, epics, they all keep the past open. Public memory transmitted over generations, they also are ways of constructing the past. And often our anguish, our sorrows, our record of suffering can only be kept through or kept alive through memories transmitted over generations. I remember I was in a women's court hearing violence. I was in the jury hearing proceedings. It's a public proceedings, unofficial commission of inquiry on women's suffering over the ages. And an African-American woman had told of a diary of one of our ancestors, a woman, where that woman writes that I know my grandmother and mother were raped by the slave-owning owners who owned the family. I have been raped, and I know my daughter and granddaughter will be raped too. That is not available in history which you study in schools and colleges. For that history, you have to be sensitive to human sensitivities. That history can be only transmitted over generations through recorded diaries sometimes at most, otherwise by the word of mouth. That those memories are held in trust by some sections of the world. Societies and cultures which have no voice in history have a voice in those private histories. If you like, it's not private history, it's these private memories which are transmitted over generations. I have told earlier that I think past can be also open. This is the fourth point. Past was specifically and clearly open in civilizations like the Cynic, the Chinese civilization, and the Indian civilization. Our utopias were often located in the past. Utopias have acquired a certain pejorative sense now. Utopianism is seen to be romantic, an avoidance of reality. Utopia in many radical literature is a term of abuse. Whatever doesn't agree with the dominant radical vision is seen as utopian, like utopian socialism, for example, and so on and so forth. But utopia also serves a function. Utopia too is a negation and a defiance of the present and the contemporary. That brings me to the fifth point, because many of these points are interconnected. There has been a theft of the future in our times. The plurality of the ideas of future has been challenged, and the back of that plurality has been broken in our public lives. The future is plural only in the privacy of our homes, or even privacy of your thoughts. To borrow from Oscar Wilde, we could say that most of the world, if you are a good Mexican or a good Indian, you do not go to heaven, you go to New York after death. You know? Previously, even there we had a little bit of choice. We were colonized by the British. Many would have wanted to go to London. Some opposite, some were radical dissenters. They wanted to go to Moscow or even Beijing. Those pluralities are dying out. Even in China, I have found that every good Chinese would like to go after death to New York. 1 billion Chinese and 1 million Indian now constitute 40% of the world. So there you have a guaranteed future. And future is known. It has to be spelled out. I mean, only it has to be spelled out or worked out through institutional means. That is our situation. This has been done by a process which I would like to call space-time translation. If you encounter a different culture in the contemporary times, it is no longer possible to see it as a different culture and celebrate it only as such. Because that difference has to be chronologically ordered. So what is India today? It is what Europe was earlier. And what is the future of India? That, of course, is to be Europe or North America tomorrow. We are all crawling up the inclined plane of history, like struggling to climb a hill, inclined plane of history. We are all trying to be like Europe. And there are on the top those who have already reached a situation, and they therefore have the right to advise you how to climb that plane well. There is no other option. We didn't have any past in any case because we are ahistorical. India and Africa were supposed to be ahistorical parts of the world. I have a story, though will give me a little bit of time, I will tell that. Karl Marx had declared that Asia and Africa were ahistorical continents. And therefore colonialism had done good. Because as John Robinson once told, the only thing worse than being colonized is not to be colonized. So, but that was what he wrote. In his private letters, I think Johann Galtung first told me about that. He had other comments to make. For instance, he said that Latin Europe also is ahistorical because Catholicism is no good. I guess Mexico falls in that category too, if it is any consolation to you. In another letter he wrote, mostly he used to say this as asides to Engels. He said, actually, the Slavs too are ahistorical. And East European too is ahistorical. They drink too much. And after some years, he also says about Scandinavia that the Scandinavians too are ahistorical, they do not bathe and very dirty. So ultimately, Marx was left with very few historical societies. Germany, where he was born, England, where he spent most of his life, and the Low Countries, Belgium and Netherlands, through which he traveled from Germany to England. But so I belong to this ahistorical society, hence my criticism of history as a social process and the idea of history, for that matter, and its limitations. In these parts of the world, we live with a different kind of consciousness, where past is plural and open. The Mahabharata, the great Indian epic, was originally only 10,000 couplets. By the time it was finished, it was 100,000 couplets. Nobody wrote. Who wrote them? Who did the interpolations, as modern scholars would say? And there are Indians struggling all their lives trying to cure Mahabharata of these extrapolations. There was a project which struggled with this problem for more than a decade. But that's the way even the epics are closed. And they couldn't stand that because even there are gods and demons in the epic, and the gods are not often godly, and the demons are not demonic enough many places. So that's a very different kind of concept of the past, but different kind of play of visions. And this is the way the history has entered our societies. Now, the alternatives to history and visions I'm talking about is the lot of the ill-educated, the savages, and the primitives. And that's the way most of these societies are thought of. They themselves have started thinking about it. That is post-colonialism, of course, that even in post-colonial world, the colonial principles have been internalized so well that now our regimes, our establishment think of the rest of the society exactly in these terms. That they also are thinking that they are the riffraff, the etc., and so forth. That they are what we were yesterday, and if they behave well and read the textbooks we have produced, tomorrow they will be like us. We therefore have hegemonized their present. We know their present better than they do, because we have been like them, but grown out of it. We are now enlightened. And they've hegemonized our future because our future is waiting to be like them. And they are already living out our future. So they know our future better than we do. That's the way. That's the game in which we are caught. I am nearing the end of my time. So I will just tell you a story. Probably that will convey at least, however insufficiently, that there are still some options left. And there are still people who do not abide by this frame given to us. A friend of mine, a famous director of a famous business school, was also a social worker. He had organized a group which was trying to improve the lot of the former untouchables in a village dominated by cobblers belonging to that caste group, the caste of cobblers who were formerly untouchables. So the village was an untouchable village. They gave the cobblers new machinery, access to the market, and new ways of organizing themselves. And indeed, their lot improved dramatically. But this friend of mine was very disturbed to hear that an old cobbler was refusing to fall in line. And he thought he would convince this old cobbler to accept these innovations. He went to the village and took the cobbler aside and said, "I hear that you don't accept these changes and do not participate in this. You don't use the new machinery. Why?" He said, "I am happy. I don't need them." So my friend said, "But your own brother is using them and has become so prosperous. His children are doing well." He said, "Yes, I know that. But I also notice that his expenses have risen. Now he cannot do without it. And I think his happiness is diminished. He is tense always and worried about the future. So he said, but what is wrong in using better technology or accessing the market? He said, it may not be nothing wrong in that. I am not saying it is wrong, but I do not want to do that. I am happy with what I have. So in desperation, my friend said, but everybody is telling you, calling you backward, old-fashioned. They say you are living in the 18th century. He said, I decide in which century I want to live. I must say to the credit of my friend that despite being head of a business school and given to this pseudoscience of management, he was humble enough to acknowledge that he had made a formidable opponent. He himself told me that he came back himself a richer person for having made this cobbler, and he learned something from it. I hope that we too pick up clues from those parts of the world who play with time in another way. Not only through artistic visions, but through the rhythm of the life they live. They also have something to share with us, and we perhaps have something to share with them. Let us make our choice. Thanks.
The shaman waits. This shaman I am speaking of, not the anthropologist's favorite subject, till the right moment when the right candidates come to reproduce himself or herself. Because the moment the shaman uses the available institutional instrumentalities, he or she becomes a part of the everyday world, a priest, someone who has power and perhaps even charisma, but is not subversive. A priest is never subversive. A priest helps consolidate a culture, whether as a priest to a revolutionary movement or as a high priest in art. He might have a subversive past, but it is only a past, and nothing is as dead as the past in a historical society. The shaman can survive in a historical society, but with difficulty. He survives usually as a relic, existing in the present under sufferance and waiting to be superseded by interpreters who will rationally and systematically explain shamanism, or if it does not stand up to critical scrutiny, consign it to history, identify it as belonging to an earlier stage in the evolution of consciousness. The shaman may even manage to survive in a historical society as a lunatic, a schizophrenic who should be psychiatrically committed, or if that one becomes politically embarrassing, as one who should be met with deafening silence. However, it is possible to argue that once you explain a shaman properly, you turn him or her into a guru, or worst, a priest, an odd, eccentric priest, but a priest nevertheless. The difference between the shaman and the priest is in some ways akin to the one that George Steiner has, I believe, drawn somewhere between books and texts. The shaman here is the text, the priest the book. A text can be read in many more ways than a book can ever be. In our times, Marx, Freud, and Gandhi are examples of men who have produced or have become texts. Most of their disciples, though, have consistently tried to turn them into books. Closed ones at that. Alternatively, the shaman can assume a prophetic voice, partly outside society and entirely outside the metropolis. Unlike the priest, the shaman can afford to be irresponsible, immature, and irrational. The shaman's responsibility is ultimately to an inner vision, or as many would put it, to an inner vision of truth. Yet it can be argued that the shaman is actually the repressed self of society, articulating some possibilities latent in a culture, possibilities which the sane, the mature, and the rational cannot self-consciously express or seriously argue. I could read that entire text by Ashis Nandy from Time Treks, replacing the word shaman with the word artist. My task was to do a little bit of human trafficking. Human traffickers are an honorable profession in Mexico, the coyotes who transport people across borders. I transported a man from one world into another world, into the world of contemporary art. I am the human trafficker who brought you here. I want to know from you what you saw in the last 3 days, what you witnessed and what you heard. What do you think of your companions, the artists?
Well, let me tell very honestly that the major lesson I learned after so many years, because I do keep in touch with the artistic productions to the extent I can, that borders are crumbling in the world of art, that younger people are experimenting with art in a way that perhaps for a long time had not been done. One of the crucial components in the world in which we live is this, that it is not through conformity that you define dominance or hegemony. Actually, hegemony is the more appropriate word. It is by laying down the rules of descent. We live in a world justified, legitimate descent, and which is unjustifiable, illegitimate descent. It is by monitoring descent through setting fashionable trends within the knowledge industry that an institutional cultures that you really monitor a society, really give the conformity a touch of vivacity, a liveliness, which should not occur. And I do notice that the kind of experiments of which we have heard and seen in the last 2 days do fall amongst those concepts of dissent which are unmanageable, unruly, and perhaps sometimes insane. I say that as a compliment.
Thank you very much. My last question before I open this up to the general house is a request for you to share a few of your memories of your association with Ivan Illich, with whom we began and whose run is a kind of subterranean theme of this conference. I say this because the whole question of another future, of deschooling ourselves, is something that you have been preoccupied with. And I know that you have a personal association with Ivan Illich and have been coming to Mexico several times.
Yes, I first met him actually in Mexico City many years ago, nearly little less than 30 years ago. Yes, not little less, 30 years ago. And gradually grew close to him. He was a remarkable person.
Do you think he was a priest or a shaman?
He was a shaman, all right. There's no doubt about that. I had people like him in mind when I wrote that particular essay. Because he had almost a panicky fear of institutions. SITAC, he used to tell to many of his friends in private, he actually closed it because it was becoming fashionable to go to SITAC or visit SITAC. And graduate students would often make a trip to Mexico to go to SITAC. So it no longer remained the institution he wanted it to be. He wanted to be a voice in the wilderness, which also reaches out to the dispossessed and the marginalized in the metropolis. That's the alliance he wanted to build. And that he never wavered from it. many of his ideas were at the same time they resonated as truthful, and yet aroused anxieties. Discolleague society is one of them. Medical nemesis is a very good example. I have myself known special issues of journals, including professional journals, devoted to the idea of ideas or devoted to the criticisms of the medical system which Ivan was venturing. Daedalus brought out such an issue. Science brought out such an issue. And not less, I must have seen not less than 15 such issues which dealt with it over the next 7, 8, or maybe a decade of that. The interesting part of the story was this: none of them mentioned the name Ivan Ilyich. None of them mentioned. They didn't want to glorify his book. The book, of course, was a bestseller, but they didn't want to acknowledge that the criticism emerged from outside medical profession. And they will refer to all other tangential work which raise some of the issues, like iatrogenesis, for instance. Like, for example, what Ivan argued, that none of the major epidemics of the world were cured by the medical system. I mean, as sanitation improved, almost, except smallpox. He always made an exception to smallpox. Except smallpox, no other major epidemic were cured. He gave the data to show how tuberculosis has already come down to 10% of what it was before the drugs against tuberculosis were discovered or developed, and so on and so forth. Cholera also. But here also, it was interesting. Actually, he was more right than he knew, because one of our friends, who was very fond of Ivan Ilyich, she wrote an excellent anthropological account of the I won't say non-modern forms of vaccination available in India and China, which also kept smallpox in check. It was called variolation. It was well known. It was many other countries also had them. So even about smallpox, Ilyich was wrong only saying his theory held, though he himself didn't know that. But he enjoyed it, the fact that she wrote this article. Yeah. So there is always this part of the story. And I remember reading a long review of his life's work, published just a few years before his death in New York Review of Books, where the whole tone of the thing was that this was a kind of a lapsed prophet who overdid and sensationalized many of his findings and so on and so forth. Time has left him behind, and by the time he was dead, his work almost was inaccessible in many parts of the world. He died a forgotten man, though he was at the height of his creativity even then.
I now open the time and space for discussions and comments. Questions?
Yeah, do you want to ask him from this, or shall I get a mic?
Yeah, there'll be a mic. You get a mic. Please be brief and introduce yourselves.
My name is Salvador, and if you're talking about a pedagogy or an education that could maybe open the past and will let us imagine a different future, I imagine which kind of mechanisms should that education have. Now they tell us that tablets will generate a revolution in education, but that's just a specific way in having a relationship with information. Which kind of interfaces, mechanisms, or mediums do you think that education should integrate so it can open the past and give us the possibility to create a new future?
There is no time for me to give an elaborate answer, but I will give a clue. Only yesterday, Oscar Hagenbeck, he talked of schools built with the active participation of communities. I believe that the educational process itself can also involve the active participation of communities. I believe that much knowledge exists still outside the formal academic structure. I will give you an example from India. I'm sure you can find similar examples in Mexico, because the answer has to be community specific. India has about 350 government universities, government-supported universities, and say another 300 private universities. The private universities do not go for humanities and arts and this kind of thing. They go only for technological education, mainly engineering, information technology, and medicine. And then occasionally they will have a school of dentistry, or amongst humanities, the only thing, or social science, the only thing they teach is economics and management sciences. That's that. But amongst the government universities in India, there are roughly 15 universities which offer courses in music. And you can even do your PhD in music. And they have produced scores of PhDs over the years, But I can also tell you that during the last 60 years, I have not seen one single musician, recognizable public musician, coming out of the university system. Not one. Some things the universities cannot teach. For that, you have to go outside the university system. I'm talking of mainly Indian classical music. Indeed, even those who have PhD degrees from these universities, when it comes to learning serious classical music, they have their personal gurus and are taught in a very old-fashioned way, like they always do. The student has to go and stay at his teacher's place. And it's a 24-hour interaction with them. And you has to imbibe the ethos of that music that particular school in which he is getting trained from his teacher. It's a one-to-one relationship. So that's the way it goes. Probably that gives you some idea how it can be. And in that kind of thing, a community becomes important. For instance, in India, there are so many institutions which train you in agronomy, but nobody has asked ever any practicing farmer to teach anything to any student in any of these agricultural universities. And yet, I remember a functionary who was himself an agronomist. He came and told me that I have come to you because of your interests, and I have read some of your writings. I want to tell you, I come here because I wanted to tell you that in the last few years I've spent in India, I have found that more than 90% of all real work on testing out a new seed or a new pesticide or a new water management system have been done by the farmers themselves. Because they are born skeptics, they distrust what is given by the government always, and they never accept it and never use it all over the land they own. They divide the land into sometimes 16 or 64 squares, and somewhere they will take the new seed and put less water, somewhere they will put more water. Somewhere they will combine it with another kind of pesticide and play out the possibilities open there. That's the way we have, that's a clue.
There have been a lot of good transfers between Mexico and India. Unfortunately, agronomy in India was imported from Mexico. That has its own story. Any other questions or? Yeah.
I just want to give like a statement about the last 3 days about the open future and the open past in form of a poem I just wrote here. It's like.
Where are you?
There. Right.
Pardon?
Here. Okay.
Here I am. Just poem. It's like an ongoing poem, like a poem loop. It's forever kind of immortal poem. It says future construction workers will construct past construction workers. Future construction workers will construct past deconstruction workers. Future construction workers will deconstruct past deconstruction workers. Future deconstruction workers will deconstruct past deconstruction workers. Future deconstruction workers will deconstruct past construction workers. Future deconstruction workers will construct past construction workers. Future construction workers will construct past construction workers. So it's like ongoing.
Nice poem. Any other questions, comments? Yes?
Hola, buenas tardes. Somos Punto Avi y Punto Exe, dos curadores de un museo de la Ciudad de México que se llama Museo del Futuro en el 2068. Viajamos en el tiempo en un proyecto de investigación para la creación de una exposición sobre el 2012, que es el momento en el cual entre 1968 y 2068 se dieron los grandes cambios que crearon nuestro presente, el 2068. Dentro de nuestro proyecto, la investigación participativa es parte de un protocolo de museo y es por eso que emprendimos en el viaje en el tiempo.
Pero nuestra máquina del tiempo sufrió un accidente y con eso perdimos nuestra memoria, con lo cual nuestra investigación ha tomado un nuevo rumbo. Es decir, tenemos que empezar primero recuperando nuestra realidad, la realidad del 2068, con la cual vamos a poder contar la realidad de ustedes, el 2012. Y es por eso que decidimos estar en estos 3 días, en el marco del SITAC, donde obviamente a partir de toda la teoría sobre el futuro, pensamos que tal vez podemos encontrar otros viajeros como nosotros, que nos puedan ayudar a guiar y recuperar nuestra memoria. Y si no, ustedes, en estos 3 días donde han habido expertos en teoría del futuro, nos pueden ayudar a discutirlo. Y bueno, la pregunta que va para ustedes dos y también sino para el público y todos los expertos que durante 3 días han teorizado sobre nuestra realidad, la cual ya no recordamos, es cuál sería la metodología para recuperar y reconstruir memoria de nuestra realidad cotidiana en el 2068.
Can we take a few more questions to the people of the future, and then we will return to your. But don't get lost.
I wanted to ask you about where one relegates nationalism. I think maybe the fight against nationalism has been the major fight of my life. You know, it's the one that kind of has organized a lot of my thinking, is the fight against nationalism. And one of the things that kind of confounds me in this trajectory is that we are always relegating it to the past, and it always becomes the future. And there is absolutely no way to produce it as a kind of as a prehistory. As a prehistory. And so I wanted to ask you about where in this kind of movement between present and future you put nationalism and the need to constantly refight nationalism.
I do distinguish between nationalism and territoriality. I think some degree of territoriality is given to humankind biologically, the way it is given to cats and dogs and to even birds. That was the principle of messaging through carrier pigeons. But nationalism is not a sentiment, which territoriality is. Nationalism is an ideology. It came into being in the 17th century when the monarchies began to collapse in Europe. And the old appeal of the king and the country, the king as the mediating between the heaven and the earth and the country, was seen as inadequate to protect the solidarity of a country. Newborn nation states. The newborn nation states looked for an ideology which will cement the bonding, and that's what they gave. And in nationalism, there are always allies and enemies. Though at least one psychoanalyst, a Turkish psychoanalyst, has argued that that is also a necessary part of being human, because we all look for allies and all look for enemies. Perhaps nationalism takes advantage of that part of our biological self, or our deeper self, whereas territoriality was dependent on another part of ourself. I do not think, in the kind of world I'm talking about, nationalism has any place. But we live in an imperfect world. The solution is not to proscribe nationalism. Solution is to work through nationalism, to see it as a homogenizing principle, see it as something which flattens differences, which is afraid of differences, which claims priority for the nation over all other allegiances, whereas in the older empires, there were the priorities were provisional. On some situations, the fact that you were a Christian or a Protestant came first. In some situations, the country and the allegiance to the king came first. In some situations, your community or caste or denomination came first. In some situation, other things came first. I think the last word on it was said by this Pakistani dissenter, Khan Abdul Khan's son, Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, who was called Frontier Gandhi, his son, Wali Khan, when he was tried for treason. He said in the court that I have been a Pakistani for 45 years, a Muslim for 1400 years. He was being tried for sedition. I have been a Muslim I have been Pakistani for 45 years, a Muslim for 1400 years. He said 1000 years, I think, 1000 years. And a Pathan for 5000 years. Don't teach me patriotism.
Any other questions? Yeah.
We are multiple selves. This idea of a unified, well-integrated self of the kind we have begun to demand from the citizens, I think itself is a dangerous contribution of nationalism.
Hola, mi nombre es Harry y quiero hacerle una pregunta como un poco personal. ¿Cómo se imaginan, cómo se imagina el futuro en parangón a estas imágenes o estas representaciones de los autos voladores, los chips integrados, o sea, como Blade Runner? O sea, ¿cuál sería la representación que no sea esa? O sea, ¿cómo visualiza, cómo se imagina el futuro del planeta?
You're being asked to be Jules Verne.
Let me make two things clear. First of all, just because I am raising some questions doesn't mean I have the answers. No? Secondly, I have found from my experience, because I've worked in this area for very many years, that human beings always find dystopias more convincing than utopias. The most influential futuristic works in my lifetime have been, first, George Orwell's 1984, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, and to a lesser extent, H.G. Wells's The Island of Dr. Moreau. All three have been immensely popular. I give this example specifically also that Orwell didn't write another futuristic novel, but Aldous Huxley did and H.G. Wells did. People have forgotten those novels. Aldous Huxley's novel was Island, which is a positive utopia. Nobody remembers it. And H.G. Wells's was Men Like Gods. Nobody remembers that. That is because it is easier to convince human beings of what should not be there in the future than what should be there. The moment you put it positively, immediately the plurality takes over and you can never have a consensus or aggregation of interests. All our positive utopias have failed. The last one fell in 1989. But all our positive utopias have failed. And it should teach us something. Whereas many of our negative utopias have done their jobs. 1984 was not what George Orwell thought it would be. And the Brave New World of Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, yet to arrive.
Okay. I want to return to the question posed by our friends from the future who got lost in 1968. I've been lost in 1968 since almost 44 years ago. It's really almost 44 years ago. But I do remember a few things about 1968. In my city, there was a man who lived in 1968 at that time. He's a man you know well. His name was Octavio Paz. He did many strange things, some of which are interesting, some of which are scary, some of which are intimidating. But there was one act that he did in the year 1968 that I can never forget. And it had to do with the fact that in your city, there was a massacre in Tlatelolco. And a heap of shoes was left behind from that massacre. And in my city, that man called Octavio Paz decided on that day to stop representing the state that had left behind that heap of shoes. That memory sustains every step I take till today. Because in my country, there are also heaps of shoes. in a place called Gawakadal on a bridge in Kashmir, there was a heap of shoes in 1991. There are heaps of shoes that continue to be present today. People have left those heaps of shoes and walked on their own paths. It's another memory from 1968. In that year, there was in this city a festival of sport. And that had something to do with what happened in Tlatelolco. There is an image from that festival that many of you may remember. Two men with their fists raised. There was a third man, the man who won the bronze medal. He was an Australian athlete. And that Australian athlete was a friend of the two other athletes who raised their fists. In fact, he gave each of them a glove. And he wore a button saying, "Sports for Human Rights." His descent was a descent of silence. So you had three athletes on the championships podium, two men with their fists raised giving the Black Power salute, one Australian man with his head bowed down in silence and mourning. That is another way to remember little things of life. And if you, as ambassadors from the future who are here with us, take back some memories of our time into your time when you find your craft again, then the story will continue. Thank you very much.